This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. This week my guest is renowned horticulturist Andrew Bunting. Andrew is the Vice President of Horticulture at the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, where he leads the utilization of planting and design to promote environmentally sound gardening practices across the organisation. Andrew's extensive experience informs the work of PHS's Public Gardens and Landscapes team, which maintains a network of public gardens and landscapes across the Pennsylvania region, contributing to vital green space, and encourages all to see the impact of horticulture in their own lives, and I must say it sounds a really wonderful organisation. Andrew's expertise extends to many subjects, but given his experience of gardening large landscapes in an area where deer are prevalent, and given that at this time of the year in the UK, our gardens are becoming tasty prospects when the wider landscape is offering slim pickings, I thought it would be really useful to get Andrew's take on managing deer. Andrew begins by telling me about his route into horticulture and what it is he does now.
I got my start probably when I was in high school. I went to a high school that actually had some horticulture classes, and I had a garden in my mother's front and backyard. She indulged me to do that when I was a kid. And then I went to a junior college and a university subsequently that had horticulture. And at both of those places, I did internships during the summer. And every summer of those 4 years, I was lucky enough to do internships at different public gardens, the Morton Arboretum and Chicago Botanic Garden near Chicago, and then Fairchild Tropical Gardens in Miami, and then the Scott Arboretum at Swarthmore College. And the last one was a year-long internship, which led me to Swarthmore College and the Scott Arboretum, where I ended up over 2 different stints working almost 30 years. And then I've also since then worked at the Chicago Botanic Garden again. And now I'm at the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, which is based in Philadelphia. We're a nonprofit that's almost 200 years old. I'm the Vice President of Horticulture, and the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society's mission is to advance the health and well-being in the Philadelphia region through horticulture. We base our work on 4 impact priorities, which include creating healthy living environments, increasing access to fresh food, expanding economic opportunity, and building meaningful social connections. And we do this work through kind of 3 major bodies. One is our Public Gardens and Landscapes, which are 80 acres of publicly accessible gardens and landscapes representing 20 different spaces. And then we also have a street tree program, a community garden program, a vacant lot program, as well as kind of a workforce development program.
Fantastic. That sounds like a brilliant society. I will need to delve more into this, I think. It sounds like a format that we could replicate over here as well.
For sure.
Yeah. We're here to talk about deer and the problems that they can cause you in your garden, and specifically the plants that you can use if you have them. So I thought before we delve into that, have you previously worked on projects where deer are a problem?
Yes, I would say almost everywhere I've worked. And for most of the time I worked at the Scott Arboretum, I also owned a landscaping company. And deer were always, I would say most always, an issue. So when we designed gardens and installed them, we were very mindful about the impacts of deer. The only places that were not impacted by deer were those that had a deer fence or some sort of fence that would keep the deer out. But that was, probably 1% of the properties we worked on.
And what species of deer are you dealing with in the US?
We're dealing with it at least in a good portion of the eastern part of the United States. They're all white-tailed deer, which is a native species, but due to development, ongoing building, their habitat has shrunk. So with the reduction in their habitat, the deer population has exploded. And then there's also no real, in most of these areas, natural predators anymore. Maybe on occasion in this area, a coyote might kill a young deer, but in maybe very rural areas, maybe mountain lions, but those animals mostly don't exist in residential areas. And most of the east coast of the United States, more or less is built up in fairly residential kind of city suburb type situations.
Obviously, you mentioned deer fencing. I'm assuming then that it is possible to exclude them completely from your garden. Is that the case?
It is. Like my property, I live in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, which is south, a little bit south of Philadelphia. I have a fairly small property, 75 feet by 150 feet deep. The whole front yard, which is not that big, it gets, a lot of deer pressure. In the back, I have a variety of fences, deer fence, a wooden fence, a building on one side. And so the backyard is, for all intents and purposes, fenced. And so I can grow everything without concern for the deer. If you don't have a deer fence, there are other ways to kind of mitigate the deer. And, there's a spray that I use called liquid fence, which has, it has a real fetid smell, and that helps deter the deer. There's also a powder, kind of a granular / powder I put down called deer scram, and that tends to help. And there's other sprays that help, but the problem is you have to apply them somewhat regularly, every say 4 to 6 weeks. So if you have a big property, that could be a fair amount of spraying. So what I do in my front yard, as an example, is I just plant plants that are deer resistant. And when I say deer resistant, that the books and literature, what they call deer resistant are, I would say, some are truly resistant, like they will not get browsed by deer. But I think a lot of plants I see listed in nursery catalogs and other references are maybe more tolerant than other plants, but not truly deer resistant. So I think it's important to know there's a distinction, and the list of plants that are truly deer resistant is relatively small.
Just going back to the fencing, is there a minimum height that you need to have for deer fencing?
It depends. So, I mean, a deer could jump as high as, say, 10 to 12 feet if it gets a running start. But the thing with the deer is for them to jump over a fence, they need kind of a clear area on the side they're jumping from and a relatively clear area to the other side. So if you have a lot of growth and brush and so forth, then the height of the fence can be considerably less. So my deer fence is only, I think, 6 or 7 feet tall, but there's a lot of growth on both sides of the fence. So I think they may walk up to the fence, but they can't get a running jump. So it'll vary on where you have the fence. But I would say generally the deer fence I see mostly is kind of a black plastic mesh. And it's, I would say, anywhere between 6 and 8 feet tall. And I think, in most situations, that's enough of a deterrent. Not to say they can't get in, and the other thing to be mindful with fencing is if there's a gap at the bottom, say over a little creek or a little channel or something, that they can actually get on their belly and kind of almost crawl under openings. So, just make sure it's well fortified from the base to the top.
That's really good information, actually. And I noticed, obviously, you use the proprietary sprays to deter the deer. There's lots of old wives' tales out there about various things like human hair. And
Eh,
if you want to pee round your boundaries, you might keep the deer out. I noticed you didn't mention any of those. Have you had any
no,
success?
I know people also we have a soap, maybe you have it in the UK as well, called Irish Spring. And it's a real like pungent hand soap. And people will take that and drill a hole in it, put like a string or wire around it and hang that around the edge of the property. But I think it probably deters the deer in that immediate area, but I'm not sure it has kind of an overarching impact on controlling deer. And the other thing to mention with fencing is that young trees and large shrubs in particular are very susceptible to deer that are rub them with their emerging antlers. So they want a tree or a shrub that's somewhat pliable, and they'll kind of come up and rub the trunks of the tree. So when your trees are vulnerable, and it's usually when they're between, say, 1 and 5 years old, certain trees are actually more vulnerable than others, ones that tend to be really pliable. And the same with shrubs, taller shrubs. So if you have those on your property and you have deer, then you probably want to fence around the trunk or the base of the plant. Leave that on until the caliper of the tree is probably at least 4 inches, 5 inches. Once it's fairly sturdy and less likely to be kind of bent over, then it's less susceptible to rubbing by the deer.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That was one of my later questions, actually. Is it just eating plants that's the problem? But obviously not. It's this kind of rubbing. Also, I'm guessing they can, if they're in any sort of number, trample on the plants too. So presumably you need to watch out for that.
Yeah, it's not to say they will always rub them, but if you have something brand new, it's probably a good practice. And with that, it doesn't have to be necessarily like you'll often see like a piece of fencing that's cut and made into kind of a circle that wraps around the tree is maybe 2 feet from the trunk of the tree. When I worked at the Scott Arboretum, what we would do is just put in maybe 4 or 5 stakes, like inch by inch stakes that were maybe 5 or 6 feet tall, 2 feet away from the trunk of the tree without any type of fencing. And if there's space, say a foot apart, then it's narrow enough that the deer can't get its head in there. So that can be an easier and maybe more aesthetic way to deter deer from rubbing.
I know here in the UK at the moment, they are very active. Is there certain times of the year you need to watch out for particularly?
Yeah, it's same here, but the fencing is also good. Just a lot of the deer will also browse young trees, so it kind of serves two purpose. So probably it's better just to keep it up year round, for the first few years of the life of the larger shrub or tree until it's more well established.
And do you find they go more for things like trees and shrubs that are at their kind of head level, or are they just completely indiscriminate? Will they go for everything?
They just go after certain plants that are not deer resistant. So, just as an example, the spice bush, the genus Lindera, all Linderas, to my knowledge, are deer resistant, while hydrangeas, almost the entire genus, and it kind of varies throughout some of the species, will totally get devoured by deer. So, that's why I think if you live in a high impact area with deer, I would just lean towards plants that have known true deer resistance.
And are there any that are completely deer resistant?
Yeah, I would say we could start with bulbs and kind of work up to perennials and shrubs. So in the bulb world, tulips will get well here they get eaten by deer, squirrels, and rabbits, especially by deer. But there are, I would say, many species in general of bulbs that are mostly deer resistant. I have heard of daffodils, narcissus in some areas where there's incredible deer pressure being browsed, but I would say mostly narcissus or daffodils are fine. Snowdrops, hyacinths, some of the little bulbs like Pushkinia, Scillas, Iphion, Muscari, Cojum, the snowflakes, they're all pretty resistant. All the onions, so like the ornamental onions like alliums with the big, globe purple heads or white heads, those are all deer resistant. Camassia is another one that's has shown good resistance. So, there's quite a few bulbs that are mostly resistant. It's just the tulips in general. There are a couple species tulips that have shown reasonable resistance, but I would probably steer clear of tulips. And then in the kind of perennial world, I mean, there are many perennials that are resistant. Some of the most popular ones that most people would know are hellebores are totally resistant. Peonies, you would think that big, like supple, kind of leafy foliage of a peony would be attractive to a deer, but both herbaceous peonies, the new intersectional peonies, and tree peonies are resistant. I would say in general, plants with fragrant or kind of smelly foliage. So there are other ornamental onions, ones that bloom in the summer that are not the bulbous types, and all of those are resistant. Things like rosemary and lavender, which have fragrant foliage, are both resistant. Around here, we have a number of native mountain mints native to the United States, but they'd be perfectly fine growing in the UK, and that's the genus Pycnanthemum. There's several species, my favorite being Muticum, which has shown great resistance. Calamintha, that's another fragrant foliage. That the cat mints, Nepeta, deer don't eat. And then in general, and I'm not sure why, but almost all ornamental grasses and all ferns tend to be deer resistant, which is, again, you would think, especially with some of the ferns, that they would be attractive to deer, but I'm not sure why they stay away from. And then every grass I've grown has shown deer resistance from big grasses. Like out front, I have Millennia, Sky Racer, but things like Panicum, the switchgrasses, we kind of de-emphasize miscanthus in most parts of the United States because of invasiveness. But I know in the UK it's grown, and that would be perfectly deer resistant. And even shady grasses like Cecilaria and Haconocloa, sedges also, which are not a true grass but a grass-like plant, tend to show resistance. And then the whole gamut of ferns, Dryopteris, Polisticum, Ethereum, Denistadia, and so forth. Those are all resistant. And, in the US, there's quite a few native ferns and grasses. So if you're looking for native plus deer resistant, there's some good choices as well. And then just to finish with a few shrubs. So I mentioned earlier the spice bushes. So here we have a native spice bush, Lindera benzoin, but I also grow out front an incredible Asian spice bush called Lindera glauca variety salicifolia, which gets great pumpkin orange fall color. The Florida anise, Elysium, that's kind of interesting. There's quite a few Asian species of Elysium, but we found that the only one that's truly resistant around here is the one that's native to Florida, Elysium floridanum. The bayberries, Myrica, which now has a new genus, Morella, sweet box, all the Sarcocoa tend to be resistant. Boxwood, so a staple plant here, and I know in the UK as well, is Buxus, the boxwood. And actually everything in that family, which includes Pachysandra, is resistant, as Sarcocoas in that same family. Yuccas are all resistant. There's a buckeye, a shrubby buckeye, the bottlebrush buckeye, Aesculus parviflora. Witch hazels are they won't eat the foliage because there's a fragrance in witch hazel foliage and stems, but you have to be mindful of deer rubbing the plant, so you may need to cage it. It's infancy. Any of the sumacs. So we grow a lot of the fragrant sumac, Rhus aromatica, but even staghorn sumac, Rhus typhina. And then a plant that does really well in kind of the hotter parts of the United States is the chase tree, Vitex. And that has very pungent foliage and stems. So they tend to steer clear of that. And then, once you start looking at all the other plants, it can be either plants that they really like or plants that they'll only eat if they seem to be really hungry. So out front, I grow different iron weeds, the Vernonias. And so I have Vernonia lettermanii, iron butterfly, which generally they stay clear of, but on occasion they will eat it. Same with like Salvia caradonna, which is a great perennial. Sometimes they leave it alone, sometimes they eat it. And then I mentioned hydrangeas earlier. There's kind of a range of hydrangeas that they like. So they like hydrangea macrophyllum serrata, the ones with the flat tops or the dome shaped or the ball shaped flowers the most. And then they probably like some of the fuzzy leafed ones the least, like hydrangea villosa, hydrangea sargentiana, even hydrangea paniculata, which is popular kind of globally. They'll eat it, but they'll eat other hydrangeas before they'll munch on that.
Brilliant. So there is loads of options.
There are. I think you just need to do kind of thorough research. We have a program at the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society called the Gold Medal Program. It's kind of like AGM with the RHS, where we select plants that are exceptional and we put them together in a database. So if you go to our website, which is phsonline.org, and there's a tab for gardeners and then a link to the gold medal plant selections. And we've been making these selections not as long as the RHS, but for about 40 years. And it's a searchable database, and you can click on deer resistant and get a complete list of deer resistant plants, or you can click on deer, sun, shrub, and that makes even a more condensed search.
Brilliant. That's a fantastic resource. Thank you for sharing that. I know obviously it would probably depend on the size of your garden, but to turn it on its head a little bit, if you were thinking about deer welfare, you mentioned that a lot of the wilder habitats have been brought into use for human use. So I'm guessing there are occasions when the deer just are hungry and they might need eat, and sometimes they eat things that they wouldn't normally eat if they're particularly hungry. I know it's not all about kind of human pressure on the landscape, but it could be exacerbated by that. Sometimes it's just a bad year, the weather's bad. Is there the possibility that you might grow some sacrificial plants or do something else to kind of help the deer but also discourage them from your own plants?
It'd be great if you could plant something that was specific for them if they only ate that. But the problem is they come in and they'll eat. I think because of the pressures on their natural areas, they probably kind of devoured whatever might be, like we have wooded areas around here, but there's nothing left in those areas for them to eat because the forests are so small around here. I was just out at Penn State University, which is kind of in the middle of Pennsylvania, and it's a very rural area with extensive wooded areas. And they have a huge arboretum right in the center of campus that really gets essentially no deer damage. And the reason is because there's enough wooded areas around the campus that there's no pressure for the deer to come into these residential areas. So I think the key is to get the population to where it's sustainable, and then to make sure that there are wooded areas, or they will eat like If you could create like a buffer of like, even in the lawns, they'll eat like clover and broadleaf lawn weeds. If you could somehow create a buffer of like a bush clover or something like that. It's not to say they wouldn't come into your garden, but if you could do something that was really leafy like that, like any of a number of the different legumes, something like that could, in theory, give them a food source so that they might not necessarily come into the garden. So, I know, especially in the UK, most of the UK is rural and you have lots of fields around your little towns and hamlets and so forth. So if there was kind of buffer areas out there that had something for them to feed on, maybe along fence rows or whatever, then that could work. The problem around here is, we have towns, but there's no open space between towns. So it just goes from one town to the other. I mean, literally from Washington, D.C. to beyond New York City is mostly just town after town after town. So we haven't been mindful of populations of natural species to make sure that there's proper habitat for them. We're thinking about it more today with, say, pollinators or migrating birds and trying to make sure that we're establishing these kind of contiguous corridors of plants or habitat that will support them. That's maybe easier to do with creating kind of pollinator gardens in urban spaces so that as pollinators move through, or even bird gardens, that there's food and habitat. That's much harder to do with mammals.
Well, Andrew, I've reached the end of my questions and that was amazing. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to add, or would you like to direct people anywhere?
Our website, phsonline.org, has a lot of information. I mentioned the gold medal program, but there's other information. And if, people are interested in getting involved in the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, we would welcome that as well. We are an institution that's very much about changing the lives of people and the well-being of people through horticulture. We really feel that it is a tool to do significant social change in so many different ways. So we do encourage people to get involved.
A really big thank you to Andrew for sharing his vast knowledge, and thank you to you too for listening. And as if deer weren't enough to deal with, here's Dr. Ian Bedford talking about another garden marauder.
Chemical-free gardens that contain as many plants, shrubs and trees as feasibly possible won't just provide safe habitats for their resident wildlife, but they'll be great places for migrant wildlife to rest and feed within too. And the more gardens that provide these safe havens, the better things will be for Britain's nature recovery plan. But for this to work within a home garden environment, it will depend on us tolerating many of the creatures that historically we branded as deplorable plant pests, because we now understand their important role within a healthy, natural, balanced ecosystem. And a good example will be the common garden snail, Cornu aspersum, a nocturnal feeder of soft-leafed vegetation that can cause significant damage to certain plants such as hostas, brassicas, lupins and marigolds. But they're also an important food source for other wildlife that we need to protect, such as the predatory ground beetles and centipedes, hedgehogs, song thrushes, frogs and toads, and even some of the small mammals that owls depend on. So rather than killing and eradicating garden snails, it's far better for the environment if we use non-toxic barriers to deter them, or, knowing that they hide up in dark places during daytime, harmlessly trapping them where they're causing a problem. And terracotta flower pots containing crocks or empty egg trays placed amongst the plants are perfect for attracting snails after their nightly feed, from where they can be collected during the day and safely relocated elsewhere. But whilst keeping snails away from tender plants, you might also find that they're actually quite interesting creatures to watch when they're active. Constantly scanning their surroundings with two pairs of tentacles, the upper with their little black eye spots looking for danger, whilst the lower pair scour the vegetation for a suitable leaf to eat, before rasping it into pieces with a ribbon-like tongue that's covered in thousands of tiny sharp teeth. Although snails are hermaphrodites that have both male and female reproductive organs, they still need to mate. But this involves a rather strange procedure, where the snails anchor together by pushing a sharp calciferous spike, known as a love dart, deep into each other's body, whilst they fertilise each other's eggs. Spherical white eggs that are then laid into the ground, which, after a few weeks, hatch into perfectly formed miniature snails, that if they don't become the food of others over the next 2 years, will become fully grown and lay eggs of their own.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.